Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio lunchtime talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and online. So whether you're in Bristol or far away, you're very welcome. My name is Lawatim. I'm the PM Studio coordinator. I'm a black man in my early 30s, wearing all black and big, thick glasses. If you don't know much about the Pervasive Media Studio, we offer these lunchtime talks as part of the Open Studio Friday offer. Every Friday, the Pervasive Media Studio throws open its doors and offers you the chance to spend time in the space, and you can hot desk here from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. every Friday. Come through those seats at the front. Feel free to move around, make a cup of tea, or grab a glass of water from the kitchens just back there. We have a quiet space just to the left, well, just to my left of this space, for anyone who needs to take a break at any point. Fire exits are at either end of the studio, and one of the studio team, probably me, hey, how's it going? We'll direct you to them should we need to use them. We're not planning a fire drill or anything, so that's probably real. So I'll put on my little pink bib and take you out. Accessible toilets and baby change can be found in the corridor next to the kitchen. A caption version of this talk will also be available on the same link after the talk's finished. This week's talk is by Joseph Wilk, an artist exploring automative. Yeah. Forms of expression that utilize new interfaces to work with alternative bodies. Joe was also one of our first MyWorld fellows in residence and spent 10 months embedded at Ultraleap, focusing on prototyping and researching hand tracking gestures for home-based VR gaming. Today, Joe is going to share an unpacking of research into how alternative bodies experience VR. So if you're ready, I'll hand over to you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone. So I'm Joe. I am very tired, and this is the worst time at the end of half term to give a talk, and I hope I make sense, but feel free to interrupt me, or if anything I'm saying is not making sense or I'm just dribbling on the floor, just prod me. So I'm gonna try and kind of thread a flow through my journey through VR, talk about bodies, talk about ideologies, and maybe present some ideas. But first, just starting with, is my volume okay, by the way? Let me know if I need to be louder. Just raise your hand or something if I'm too quiet. So I'm a digital artist, and I feel like it's worth just setting my context of how I think about the digital. So I see the digital as real. Often the digital is criticized as, you can't see it, you can't touch it, and hence maybe it's not real. But that's not how the laws of physics work. If you can't see something with the human eye or touch it, does not mean it does not exist. There are many subatomic things going on which we can neither see or touch, but they do exist. If we look at what happens with digital work, bits are being written, heat is being generated, something physical is going on. So in my mind, the digital is real. It's just that it's often conflated with being the same as the physical, which is where the problems start to come. A digital chess piece is not the same as a physical chess piece. I am a big fan of board games, and part of the reason for that is the tactility of being able to touch stuff, right? But the digital facilitates new and different forms of expression, which is where it's interesting. Rather than trying to replicate the physical world, it means I can play chess in chess VR with a friend on the other side of the planet, which is cool. So I sit, oh sorry, I didn't do an audio description. I'm a 40-year-old white male with a very pink wheelchair and as much pink as I can possibly get. Anything that isn't pink is because it's not manufactured in pink, which is a question to raise. So I say that because I'm sitting in a wheelchair, which is quite important to what I'm going to say. I've been messing around with digital art, and during the pandemic, I got approached a lot to test out VR experiences. And I would have conversations with galleries saying, hey, we've got this VR thing you can try out. And I'm like, cool, how is access to your gallery? And they're like, no, we've got this VR experience which we want you to test. I'm like, but physically, could I come into your space? And they're like, no, there's some issues there, but we've got VR. And I'm like, okay, no. This is not a conversation to have, and VR cannot fix the broken foundations it's built on. We can use it to explore them, maybe even challenge them, ask some questions, but the underlying issues, and I have this a lot, is ramps and lifts are way more important than VR and AI. Yeah. But the digital really can be meaningful. It's a valuable experience. This was a performance I gave in New York at the Westbirth Gallery, where I was streamed into the venue. I'd been learning as a remote student, the only remote student as part of an art school for the School for Poetic Computation. And this was really me communicating and surprising a lot of people coming to the gallery because they did not expect a live person to be sitting in front of their screen talking to them. And this was a really meaningful way to engage with people, to kind of surprise them, but also kind of explore that I was a remote student, which was meaningful, also had lots of bad things about it, being like left on a shelf and everyone else going out to the pub sort of stuff, right? Complex, but meaningful experiences. And I guess what I'm going to talk about and touch on here is, yeah, the digital can be meaningful, but whose body do I get to do it in? And whose fantasy am I participating in? And who has control of that fantasy? Who has control of that body? But before I get onto that, I want to deal with that word ideology, which is in the title. This is hard to explain, and I won't be able to because this is a hard book to read, but it's worth reading. So the idea of software as ideology comes from Wendy Chun in this amazing book, Software and Memory, can't read that, yeah, Programmed Visions, sorry. And she talks about a lot of things in this book, but kind of ideas around the fact that there's a lot of abstraction going on in machines, how code is seen as having some kind of power, and the actual work is ignored or gone away, much in the way that law and in ideological systems is represented. And for so there's also a lot about gender as well, and the fact that programming is based a lot on the military speak of command and control, telling a computer to do something, it goes and does it. Initially in programming, a lot of that work was done by women. Women were the original programmers, and effectively the mathematician would come in with a card, give the people the card, and they would plug in the wires and do a bunch of really cool programming, and were basically debugging systems and doing so much cool stuff. And that kind of got erased and taken away as abstraction started to happen. And for the purpose of this talk, what I'm really interested in is the idea, the projection of the consciousness of the ruling class shapes the structures that we experience, specifically thinking about technology. And that layers of abstraction mean often the way that we experience, oh, those seagulls are loud. We experience, let me go where my brain was. Oh yeah, the way we experience those systems is abstract from the belief system. And I'm trying to look at, hey, like in VR, in technology, what are the people who create this stuff thinking, and how are they enforcing that upon us? Alexander Galloway kind of did a whole another bunch of stuff around software as ideology, but he also went further and started talking about interfaces. That interfaces are something that aren't a thing, they're an experience, and they represent a social history. A good example he talks about, I think this is from Windows, I can't remember if it's XP or 3.1, the creation of icons in our operating systems, which came from a bunch of largely white men, kind of, I think, working, at least coming from Xerox in the US. And what they did when they said, hey, like, what is a computer? How are we going to represent a computer? Was they went away and looked at their office spaces and said, well, we'll just replicate what we know, what makes sense to us, and this is how you will use a computer. And we still have the concept of like a filing system. I'm trying to think, I don't think I've ever actually seen a filing cabinet in my life. I mean, maybe that's just me, but I don't know what one is really. But yet when I think about a computer, I'm thinking about folders and putting like pieces of paper inside folders. This mindset that came from these like US researchers, again, there's a lot of like ties in there with the military and lots of stuff going on. This is now how we think about computers, right? So that belief system has been enacted upon us and shapes the way we think about these systems. He also goes on to talk a lot about how interfaces can tell us a lot about the systems that they're created within. So this is a screenshot from World of Warcraft, and he talks about the fact that this starts to represent the kind of information sweatshop, the factory floor within capitalism in a general sense. That we have all this overlay of information on the experience of reality of this perspective in this game world, and how we are measuring ourselves, how we are trying to think about productivity, how we have progress bars which tell us how far we are away from achieving our next goal. And this is a lot of reflection about how we value labor, how we value production, and it starts to manifest itself. It makes sense, right, in the games that people are creating and the games that we play. It starts to ask whether, is it a game or is it work? I don't know. We see this in VR as well. Some of the experiences, this is Startenders, where you effectively make drinks for people. They give you tips if you do well. If not, they walk off and they're angry. I don't understand how this is like a game, but it just feels like so dystopian to me of what can we make that's a game? Well, let's just like reproduce like service labor and like optimize it so that if you do really well, you get a tip. What is going on there? There's also kind of ties in, which I'll float on, but I won't go too deep into, with Zizek's Pervert's Guide to Ideology, where he talks about Coca-Cola and some of the advertising techniques used by people like Coca-Cola to tell us that, you know, what are adverts for Coke saying? They're saying, hey, why are you missing out? Why are you not having fun? And VR feels like this constant stream of like, why are you not amazed? Why is this not like blowing your mind? And this sums up like the entire 10 months of working in VR was people going, wow, and you've been like, yeah, sure, yeah, okay. So how does history teach us to design for bodies? For this, we're going to take a brief sideline to Henry Dreyfus, an American kind of industrial designer who was involved in a lot of the kind of 20th century products that we know, like the kind of dial phone, I've got a list of them, the alarm clocks, thermostats, Hoovers, Polaroids. He had a very large part to play, not just in the physicality of these products, but also the ergonomics. And that was his big contribution, was that he started using, I guess, what we would call kind of data science to try and find out what were the standards for how we build for a human body. What can a human body do? And he published this, The Measure of a Man, Human Factors in Design, in the 1960s, effectively trying to categorically say what a human is capable of. And this defines a huge amount of how we see ergonomics now. And you'll encounter this still in VR when people talk about where you should put things, like how far away should a screen be in VR? How much can a person reach to get to things in VR? At least this definitely has a US bias, and I don't know how much that applies to the rest of the world. A lot of VR is coming from American companies, so I'm trying to like draw an analogy there. But this has a huge influence in the field of ergonomics and what humans can do. And this was all done by sampling a large number of people and creating tolerances of like, where can people stretch to? Where can people sit with? VR introduced a whole ton of new stuff, like I forget even what it's called now, like I think it's called an elephant neck or something, where you have too much weight, wrist strain. There's new stuff happening, but there is a lot of basis in this for how we design for VR. And for my interest, he specifically tried to create what a disabled body can do, like what can a person in a wheelchair do. He also did, I think, kind of like strollers, various accessibility implements. And he kind of, this really like defines the US's accessibility culture in the built environment. Because in the US, they actually decided to enforce access as a legal right. A lot of this stuff is present in the built environment, and he is responsible for having tried to categorize what this is. And as we see, it's a bit problematic, but it is also very clear that this is a lot better than the UK, which didn't regulate, and I'll stop there. If we look deeper, and a lot of the language in this book that he wrote is really problematic, I think there is a lot of biases in the data set collecting, but specifically what I'm going to narrow in, because it connects to my own experience, He estimated, I guess in the 1950s, there are about 680,000 wheelchair users. It's actually a much higher number now. And what we saw in those measurements were for 284,000 wheelchair users. Then there's 146,000 who have more complex spinal issues, of which kind of floats, well, they can't do a lot of these motions, but there's some of the upper tolerances that they might be able to do. And then for 30% of the remaining people, I'll read it because it makes me think a lot. People who use wheelchairs are convalescent and little information about them is available. 30% of wheelchair users were not deemed to be interesting enough to think about from a design perspective. So while we have a lot of really interesting improvements in our built environment, clearly there is an ideology, there is a belief system in here of like, is that really worth the cost? Are we really willing to put that amount of effort into how we think about what a wheelchair is? Oops, sorry. So that takes me to VR and bodies in VR, kind of looking at how bodies and interfaces are experienced in VR. And again, I'm framing this a lot from my own body, my own experiences. So clearly you're not supposed to move using your hands in VR to various degrees, but it's obvious to me, but maybe it's not to everyone, that this is how I move using my hands. And so if I have a cage around my wrist, I cannot move. I don't know even how to put that. I cannot do VR on the PlayStation. That's the top left one there is the Sony PlayStation controller. I just can't use that. That's like a cage around my wrist. I'm literally frozen in place. So clearly, there is not a lot of thought into what tolerances might be, or maybe just that it's not seen as something that's important right now. Most of my research, and when I talk about that ruling class bit in the ideology, I'm talking about meta. There are other people in this space, and maybe those experiences are different. My research really focused on meta. They are the largest headset market, and they have a lot of money and a lot of power. So most of my thoughts are dealing with meta. I think ended up user testing about 60 or 70 VR games. And while I had some fun, I think there was only maybe 1 or 2 that I could actually play and not have an accessibility issue with. I literally, for at least 60 to 70% of these, didn't make it past the tutorials. Meta makes a big statement, right? Going beyond Henry Dreyfuss's sort of ignore 30%, Meta says, hey, we're making VR for everybody, right? That is a very bold statement, but this is like $1 trillion company. What do we find out? They mandate certain criteria around what games have to have when they're released to the store. And they have a bunch of really good accessibility kind of guidelines, which make a lot of sense. But all of those options are optional, optional. And what happens when you make access optional? Well, that's the UK, right? That effectively you put cost against access. And unfortunately, in most cases, money tends to win in that situation. And it would explain why the Meta store is just really bad with accessibility and my own experiences. I don't know if this is how Meta is presented to other people. Within social media, I have the little wheelchair emoji in my profile. And I don't know if I'm being targeted or other people see this, but I am very much presented from Meta the idea that my body using a wheelchair, it's been designed for me. It's been supported for me. I hear a wheelchair user wearing a VR headset having an amazed expression on their face. But when I try and design my body in the virtual, I find there's a very limited sense of what a body is, right? I can't specify that I use a wheelchair. My wheelchair is my body. I connect with it like that, but there's no ability to express that fantasy in this world. There is a single thing, which is hearing aids. It's the only thing I could see that would be what I would refer to as an accessibility aid or an alternative machine body. There was the recent patch while I was doing this research that introduced legs. I really struggle on how to describe this to people. The best I've got is this is a little bit like kind of body dysphoria to me. I can't really describe to you how uncomfortable this makes me. I'm not really able to express what's going on there other than that this is not me. This is my avatar, this is my representation. I'm given creative agency. I can make them look like a fairy and have cool like leaves and things. But then I'm provided with such like a disconnect with actually how I want my body to be in this virtual space that if I were, I had conversations with PM Studio while I was doing my research, and if I were not part of the fellowship, I think I would have just stopped and just, that's it, I'm done. Right, like this is that, I'm trying to convey how intense emotion that was of like, yeah, I'll just stop because I think I'll go too far. There is still, and I kind of was shocked to still see this stuff in there, that there's still the assumption that you can touch the floor in how you configure your play space in VR. And there are ways to bypass it with controllers. There's certain states where you use your hand tracking, which is really useful if you need to move your body, so you don't have a controller in your hand, that you cannot calibrate your play space, even in the new MetaQuest 3 that does depth scanning of the floor, without touching the floor with your hands. If you can't touch the floor with your hands, effectively your offset of the floor is wrong for every single experience you have, which basically means everything is broken. Yeah, $1 trillion company, sure. Oh, sorry, did I go backwards? Yeah, I did go backwards. There we go. There are accessibility options that Meta provides, and they are par with platforms like Sony and Microsoft in their consoles and their gaming. Specifically, most of my body problems are about most of my body experience is about height, right? There's a lot of assumptions that I can reach high or get to things. This is the height adjuster. I still don't understand what this is supposed to achieve other than somehow place the interface where I can't get to it. Like that is the only option I have to like adjust my height, and it doesn't work, and often ends up where I just have to reboot the machine because the menu is floating above my head and I can no longer get to it. There is an interesting disconnect, and again, like I'm not necessarily expecting game designers to think about this, but it's just interesting to reflect that there are things going on subconsciously that with my body and the way I use it that are very clearly disconnecting with the VR design. When I move, I often will just put something on my lap because I need to move around, I need to use my hands, so I will put a glass down on my lap and move. And obviously VR doesn't know what my body is, so it just smashes on the floor and I'm like, okay. Again, like maybe a trivial thing, but again, it's the reminder of like, no, this isn't your fantasy, this isn't your control, this isn't your virtual body. This is the reminder that you're kind of, you're allowed to participate, but you're not allowed to fully be in a body. And VR is all about bodies, but you can't be present in yours. VR, sorry, I'm just gonna grab some water, my voice is going. So VR clearly is not for everyone at the base level of the operating system and what Meta provides. They do provide some guidance for accessible games. I don't know if I have to explain. Okay, this is their list of accessible gaming. It makes the most blatant fail of accessibility guidelines by putting white text on colorful backgrounds. That means anyone with any sort of visual impairment, even I find it difficult to read what this text is. If this were some like indie studio, like knocking out games and was struggling to make financial things, okay, like maybe I could say, hey, like I kind of get it, it's tough. But this isn't that, right? This is a company that's defining VR, that is providing the option for us to find accessible games, and they're not even showing that they care about the very basic level of accessibility. We get comfort ratings, which is one way to kind of evaluate what how an experience might be, and a lot of really interesting writings from an accessibility perspective have been written about the fact that this means nothing. Nobody understands what this is. What does it mean to have a comfort rating that is unrated, that like there is no rating for it? I can't think of a rating system that makes sense for, right? And so This here provides you absolutely no information on access, right? You have to just buy the game, try it for yourself, and discover that it doesn't work. Height. This is one of the games that I'll just go through. I'm going to show a few things because I could just show like hundreds and hundreds of things. There's going to be some writings about some of this stuff if you're interested, but a lot of games assume that you're standing by default, which means that they route the menus up here, which means you can't reach the button to say that you're in seated mode. And that's what I'm trying to convey with like, oh, I tried this game. Oh, I can't reach the button. Okay, that's it. Done. Yeah. What is going on there? And height adjustment. People implement it, but again, I don't understand exactly what's happening here. It doesn't feel like anyone is doing any testing with any lived experience about how these things function. This allows you to adjust your height. Surprisingly, I don't actually know the millimeter height adjustment that I want in a game. This provides you with no live feedback, so you're just mashing different settings and seeing like, hey, am I sick enough yet that I want to stop this game? And again, like this is where the game ends for me, of like, okay. And it's not like this is an infrequent like thing you can just do at the beginning. This is like, okay, I'm just constantly doing this because I need to go from different heights to reach different things. Yeah, again, what is happening? One of like the big popular games, Beat Saber, it specifically says it is for standing. It can be played sitting. Again, it feels like VR is quite far behind like console gaming and accessibility. You can play Beat Saber sitting, but you're just going to face plant walls constantly. Let me just play that again because I like it. Yeah. So again, you're like, this is fun, but like having a wall smashed through your head that you can't dodge repeatedly. Again, it's like you get that tiny taste of what VR might be, but you're constantly reminded this isn't your body and you have not been facilitated in this design. So I, for myself, have learned how to function even in a physical world that doesn't facilitate my body. Like if I took you to my apartment, like I have bits of sticks, crutches, things that I kind of move around, grab. It's effectively, I've adapted to how I can function in that space when I can't always change it. But none of these accessibility aids exist in VR. Suddenly I am stripped of all the creativity I have about my body and just given nothing effect, right? Which again feels like, why would I want an experience that strips me of my body creativity? So what is going on here? I talked about that kind of like the consciousness of the ruling classes. Like, what is this statement mean, making VR for everyone? And again, this is pure supposition because this is me just trying to work out what is happening in this world. VR is being made, my guess, by people for people like themselves, much like in Xerox, how we saw in the American office, where white men were building what they saw as offices and replicating those into interfaces. What we're seeing in VR, to me, is that there are no people who have those experiences like my own that are using that in their design process. And again, like, I've been trying to work out how to say this sentence for like days and days and days. Like, cost is a massive factor here, and I think what we're seeing, again, I wouldn't mind if Meta was like, hey, VR is really experimental, we don't know what we're doing, and it's a lot in flux, like we're trying to work it out. But it's that contradiction between, hey, it's for everyone, but really we're only willing to spend the minimal amount of money, and we're really not very interested in even thinking about accessibility to any degree. Comes down to cost again. But I'm being super negative about VR, and I want to also shout out some positivity. There are companies, Alchemy Labs, which was bought by Google. It's almost like they're trolling Meta with this statement. They have this thing like VR for everyone, and they're like, no, really, no exceptions. I feel like if you want to learn more about accessibility and some of the possibilities, Cosmonus High is just, I can't even describe how far ahead it is everything else that exists in VR. If there were a template of how VR could be accessible, it's probably in that game. So nice work on Alchemy Labs. But there is a separation in this virtual body between fantasy and disability. If we look on like what options are possible for your avatar, it's interesting to notice that the feature brands are effectively all people who are paying Meta to sell assets that are promoting them and they're making money on, right? So this is very much a commercial sense of what a body can be. And what we encounter is that the idea of disability being associated with fantasy is, again, I can't say why, but it's not in that mindset, not in that ideology. I was just going to read something from Natalie Decker, who designed these beautiful wheelchairs and strollers, because she put it much better than me. Critical bodies deserve recognition for their aesthetic power. Crypt bodies deserve desire. Crypt fantasies speaks to a future world where difference is celebrated and disability is researched and understood more holistically, away from the hospitalization and sterility and towards an approach that encompasses the mind, the body, and the soul. It's a project called Crypt Fantasies. It's amazing. I highly recommend checking it out. So some of the kind of responses I get when I have conversations with people working in VR about this seems to be the kind of idea that the simulation eventually is going to be so real that all these things will just resolve themselves. That we'll get, yes, so perfect to reality that access will disappear. Again, like take you back to that first slide where we talked about VR doesn't fix the foundations. And again, this kind of comes down to cost, right? As in, like, we look at Henry Dreyfus, we see very clearly that a lot of people were ignored and weren't considered human, weren't regarded as having value, and design moved forwards. So if history has anything to say, looking back at that, it feels like we're just going to encounter the same situation. If that, sure, the technology might get better, but will it actually facilitate and spend that money to target everyone? We can see so far that it hasn't. Proving physicality. The hello world, this for me is an odd thing that happens in VR. And I see it akin to the Hello World program. In the early days of computer programming, where people were trying to sell the idea that computers were a useful thing, it was kind of the fun, like, hey, look, if you print this statement and tell it to do it, it says hello. And it's like, wow, like computers, they're actually a thing, and they do what you tell them to do. And VR is obsessed with this concept of physicality, irrelevant of whether it's fun or part of something you want to do. It just constantly says, hey, like, open this drawer, there's stuff in here. And it's like, okay, from an access perspective, I can't do that. That's where the game ends for me. But also, it's not a lot of fun. Pick up the book. There's a book on the floor, right? This is VR. It's physical. I can't reach the book because it's on the floor, and that's the beginning of the game, and the game ends. Again, like, physicality, right? Like, this is real. This is meaningful. This is a beautiful scene. I was testing Half-Life Alyx, and I just stopped for like 10 minutes and just looked at this, the computer graphics and the like lighting and the texturing, and I was like, this was amazing. I haven't seen anything quite like this before. And then what did I do? I went and opened all the drawers and all the cupboards, because that's what you have to do to discover stuff in the world. Again, like, sure, it's physical, but is this fun? Like, this is a game. I'm not doing this to train myself how to open cupboards. I'm actually doing it because it's an enjoyable thing. And then VR has this really difficult conflict, and it's trying to do that hello world. It's trying to be like, look, like, this is really physical and it's a different experience, but at the cost of fun. In-world accessibility kind of also struggles with this concept. The idea that everything has to be physical means that what you start to get is, well, if you want to turn on access features, we'll give you a physical backpack, and we will have things you have to lift open, things you have to push, things you have to slide. Again, physicality can be a barrier to accessibility. So if for any reason you can't reach or make these things, again, the game experience ends, and you can't turn on the things that are designed to help you play the game, because we're trapped in this. It's physical. Physicalness is more important than access. One very specific example, there is a little handle on most tables and surfaces in kind of VR world where it's like, look, you can adjust the height of the table. So wow, like my problem with height and having to do Meta's thing is resolved. I have a handle I can pull, but I can't reach the handle because it's too far down. So I can't adjust the height. And so again, like, the obsession with physicality has removed all the effort around accessibility. It's worth touching on, but I'm not going to delve too much into, because I just don't know what to think about it. if you look at what's popular on the Meta store, it's clear that violence is a big thing. Violence is a part of computer games. I have played violent computer games. Again, something is different in VR, as in it's about bodies and that virtual body and being simulatory. This is a shot from Saints and Sinners, which is kind of like a zombie horror game. I didn't make it past the tutorial because it wanted me to put an axe into the brain of a zombie. And I just didn't want to apply enough force to the axe to actually hurt it. And again, it was because I had to take an axe and go like this, right? And I'm like, I don't really want to simulate this level of violence. Like the abstraction of having a controller and hitting buttons is like, okay, you know, like this isn't my body participating in violence. And something happens in VR where it feels like everyone is really into violence. There are many other games there, and I don't want to imply this is everything, but if you look at the chart and look at the top games like Resident Evil, like Sword and Sorcery, it's literally like, what are the different ways you can kill people and hurt people? Yeah, empathy and simulation. Again, this is a pretty deep-rooted one in the VR experience. Often we get a lot around how VR is about empathy and how suddenly being in a body means that we can be more empathetic. And VR as a kind of an experience is the most isolated, singular body experience I can almost imagine, to the point of sensory deprivation, right? As in you cannot, even if you're looking for a camera, you cannot truly see people. You are separated from the world, and there is a unit of one. There is no true shared experience, right? Everyone has to have a headset on. Everyone needs to buy a unit, a machine, which to me really speaks about the people that are making VR, because from a capital perspective, everyone having to buy a screen so you could all sit in this presentation as opposed to one screen is a big incentive financially, but it fundamentally misunderstands empathy. And I learned this from a PM talk, that empathy is not about being part of a body and then having bad experiences or having experiences, right? It's about witnessing a body, having an experience and being like, crap, that looks awful. That is not me. I do not have that experience, but as a human, I connect with your experience and I feel sad, or whatever emotion is there, I feel something, right? It's almost like that's the antipathy of VR slightly. But there are people, sorry, I got cut off the top. This is the image from Goliath, which does really approach the idea that you are looking at someone rather than trying to be inside their body, which is super important for empathy. So, rounding off, a question I keep asking, and I've been asking myself for a long time, is can VR ever really be accessible if it's so caught up in the physicality of the experience? Can my body ever be facilitated? Looking through the history of design, it's clear that these things keep falling through. There are people being ignored. And really the question comes down to, can VR ever really understand my body? And I think it's pretty clear, no, it most definitely can't understand my body, right? I mean, I call this like the gulf of imagination, right? I don't think anyone in this room could even conceptualize what my body is capable of, right? That's a very personal experience. That's something that I'm still grappling with and understanding, right? But yeah, I do understand my body. And if we want to talk about how VR might be accessible, it's really accepting that something that is currently not possible with a closed ecosystem like Meta, but is possible in platforms like Steam, is that people can design for themselves. They can hack something together, which breaks so many of the things about physicality is the important thing. It says, hey, maybe you want to play VR with a controller. Maybe you actually just want to move yourself using a game controller. Walking VR is a really good example of a community-driven attempt to actually provide a bunch of things, which mean you can play VR. It might in some ways defeat the purpose of VR by removing a lot of the body involvement, but it gives people a choice, which for me is paramount of do you really want these experiences or not, is the most important question. And what does the disabled community have a history of doing? Well, it's just breaking things apart and finding out how they want to express themselves, how their bodies want to be facilitated and experienced. Specifically companies, and we looked at Meta, we looked at all these different ideologies, we looked at design from Dreyfus. None of these people are addressing some of the needs of complex bodies. And so what happens is we just start hacking things together outside of company structures, outside of their value system, because we want to play. It does then tend to get consumed and turned into a product and sold by companies. This is Microsoft Accessible Controller, which is effectively them productizing access. It turns out that the controller was such a great idea that everybody wanted one, because like pro gamers were like, wow, I can like completely configure this so I can use it in any way I want. Again, like a disability-led approach to design. These are called tactiles, which are effectively teaching Braille through bricks. This was stolen by Lego and sold as their own idea and their own design. Again, a disabled-led approach to coming up with a solution that benefited the community from the people who had that experience. Companies taking it and selling it, that is a complex thing, which I'll park aside. But this key aspect that in order for VR to be accessible requires people to have the agency to be able to hack systems for their own bodies, because only they understand those bodies. So how do I feel about VR? What do I think about VR? I do feel right now, at least the way it is, that VR is just reality, but a little bit worse for me. It does feel like that same movement in lots of digital technology about everything is just getting a bit worse, while we're told it's so amazing, like, wow, look at this sort of thing you can do. And again, it strips me of my creativity as a body to move around the world. Why would I choose to do this when it's worse than reality? Like the fantasy and some of the promises of VR of being able to experience zero-G. I'm like, wow, let's face it, I'm probably not going to be able to go into space. That is a really cool thing to be able to experience in VR. But my experience of VR was like, hey, you're locked into a cage. Could you reach that button up there to release yourself so you can experience VR? No, I can't do that. End of zero-G experience. So this VR is supposed to be entertainment. This is supposed to be something which is bringing me pleasure, and it just feels worse than reality. And reality is already pretty challenging. Why would I just accept something being even worse? And there is some healthy competition here in that Meta is selling this as a games platform. There's a lot else going on in other fields, but I really am narrowing down to games. For whatever reason, there are a lot of publishers and a lot of game studios who are really, really invested in accessibility. This is like the awards that happens for those that have most, like the best accessibility in games. Specifically looking at consoles, these companies are, I don't even know how to explain with an adjective how far ahead they are of VR. And if VR is entertainment, then I'm just going to do this. Like these accept what my body is. They're designing for me. They have lived experience in the design for it. And if I'm going to choose, and again, like in this capitalist system, basically the only thing I can really do, other than give a talk to you people, is where I put my money. So if I'm going to give my money to these people who welcome me rather than people who seem to exclude me. So thank you. That was the ideology of bodies.
So we've got a bit of time for questions now. If you're in the room, put your hand up and I'll give you this mic. It doesn't amplify your voice, but it's just so the people who are watching online can hear you. If you're watching online, put your questions in the YouTube chat and Danielle will read them out for you. So, any questions for Joe today? Anyone? Don't be shy. Yep.
Thanks. Really, really interesting talk, illuminating. But I guess, well, you've been doing this testing for Meta and for these VR games companies. Why are they not doing iterative testing or co-design with disabled people if they're developing accessibility features that are really buggy and don't work?
So if you look at Alchemy, they use a consultancy company that provides access testing. That's a lot of how they do their work. So there are companies who will do VR kind of access testing. I simply can't answer that. I don't understand how it's so bad. And it would not take much to, I mean, just a very small amount of work. Again, I assume it's a prioritization of profit. I can't see what else it is. They would, like, if they made it accessible, like that's one of the big arguments of like opening the market. That's a very valuable thing, purely from like a commercial sense, right? But there's a lot of experimentation in VR. I get that. It's something new. No one quite knows how to design spatially. I think there's a lost in like newness. There's a lot around why that newness doesn't include access. Again, with kind of Dreyfus and all the other history, that's a pretty common thing, and it usually represents the bodies in the room that are involved in that process. Kind of my perspective is just being as loud as possible, that this is like, this is beyond bad from their perspective. Yeah, I do not know.
I mean, that you would think there would be a commercial, as you say, imperative that opens up kind of new audiences for VR and spatial computing, and so you would think that they would do participatory design and co-design with people with lived experience of access needs. Yeah,
very much so. I think that if we look at kind of like regulatory, there is like, we talk about the web, we have accessibility standards on the web. They're probably actually in contradiction to those accessibility standards, but those are legally enforced. In VR, there's nothing, right? Like there is no regulatory framework to say, hey, like this is how it should be. So there's no law, and the US functions on law and being sued in order to enact access. That's how the system works. It tends to work most of the time. And that is one thing. Oh, I lost my trail of thought, sorry. Talking about law, access. Yeah. No, my brain's just fried. Sorry.
Well, regulation you were talking about.
Yeah, that doesn't exist, so there's no like incentive to do that stuff. And if, oh yeah, that's what I was thinking. And if we look at people like Microsoft, they are really heavily invested in access. They put a lot of money into access. They do a lot of work. So there clearly are companies that do value this and are trying to open up that marketplace. It's a mystery to me. I think it says something about the ideology of the company, right? It's like their belief system. And as much as Microsoft is definitely not a great company, it's interesting that they value access so much.
Yeah, thanks. Any more questions? Jess? No? Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, thank you so much for that talk. That was loads and loads of food for thought. I guess the sort of the spatial computing elephant in the room right now is Apple and the Apple Vision Pro. Obviously, it's a bit early doors to know much about what the accessibility levels are likely to be, but do you have any kind of guesses or predictions based on the way that Apple tend to manage ecosystems?
Yeah, so I have not experienced the Vision Pro, but I have done research into all the videos around access and what they provide. And it looks very positive. Apple has a good history of trying to design accessibility built in. There is always options at the OS level for the Vision Pro where you can not necessarily use different mechanisms for engaging with the interface. So if you don't want to use your hands, you can use your eyes. There are options built in at the operating system level which feel good. How do people build on top of those platforms, and what games and what platforms people build on that? I don't know. Apple tends to be pretty strong about enforcing that. They have a high kind of boundary for what is acceptable. Yeah, I think it's kind of a wait and see, but it definitely, again, like push the access is important, and building it at the operating system level is like, why would you not build it in at the OS level? Because then everybody gets to benefit from, rather than a piecemeal approach, which we see with Meta, where the operating system doesn't really do it. So everyone's doing their own thing. They're all doing it in a different way, and that's not what you want from access, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to keep the questions coming from this row. I was just curious about your kind of definition of empathy within how you were talking, and it sort of felt, if I understood you right, it kind of threw up for question that kind of cliched idea of like, you know, like walking in someone's shoes, or that kind of idea. And I just wondered if you could expand on that a bit.
It was from a talk at PM Studio. I forget who gave the talk, but that's what kind of taught me about it. And it was an audio project which was exploring the immigrants' experience and was kind of exploring the idea, should you be them or should you listen to them? I think my understanding is there are problematic reasons to being inside a body and trying to pretend that you have those experiences. I think of how certain councils gave wheelchairs to the councillors and asked them to move around the city. I find that quite problematic because it's like you will not get my like lived experience from like that. So I think like the simulatory aspect is quite harmful because it might lead you to think, oh yeah, now I know like a wheelchair experience is bad in this city, as opposed to like, actually a wheelchair is a really cool, joyful thing, right? And they're not going to get that. They're going to be like stuck in the built environment. Well, a lot of my work is about disabled joy and the fact that I love my wheelchair. It's like freeing, it's beautiful, it's such like an amazing thing to me. And I don't know how you can have that experience without maybe just seeing someone talk about that and say, hey, that's how my body feels, right? Because we can't put ourselves into those people. I think also just about human connection, right? I think that, again, like what is VR missing is a lot around that human connection. And what is empathy? It's about connecting with humans, right? It's literally like feeling for other humans and going, hey, I care about you and I connect with you, right? And again, if you frame that from like an isolated body experience, you're not actually ever connecting with another human being, which even if there is some theoretical, like someone could argue that is empathy, I feel like that's not a positive empathy, right? That's not leading to like, to actually how that might change your actions, how you might like think about how you might have conversations, how you might connect with people. If you see someone having that bad experience, maybe you want to talk about it, right? And like learn more from their experience rather than get stuck in like the simulatory, like I've had this now and now I understand this thing.
Do you think that like Meta is kind of thinking about empathy in that very narrow way then?
I think VR is stuck in that single headset glued to your forehead that turns off the world. And it's struggling to work out how to do that. I guess mixed reality and some of the attempts around kind of blended reality maybe starts to address that, that you can start to have more human interaction and hence have those experiences. I don't think Meta is really doing anything or even thinking about empathy. I think, again, the creatives working with VR, like people like Goliath, are thinking about this stuff because they kind of get it, I guess.
Any other questions?
Cool, just one there.
Hi, thank you. I was just thinking about legislation again for a minute. And I was wondering what you think about, I guess right now there's no kind of law in place about this, right? Because I guess if it's for entertainment, if that's what it's kind of being advertised as, there's not very many laws in place for entertainment, whereas I guess with something a bit more essential to society, there is a greater, I don't know if needs the right word, but you know, a greater consensus that needs to be legislated for. And I was wondering what you think about potentially we are going down a route where VR is going to become a greater part of life, maybe not just in terms of games or that kind of element of stuff, but like I've just Googled the Apple Vision thing, and that feels like, I don't know, 10 years down the line, maybe that's how it will work. And then I just wondered if you had any thoughts about whether at some point this will need to be in law to kind of make, if we begin to live a lot of our lives in these virtual realities, do we need to have laws that protect people to make stuff more accessible within these new realities?
Oof, there's a lot there. I'll try and unpack a bit of that. From the legislative perspective, if we look at the internet and the web, yeah, that's worked, right? It's the fact, again, like there's a financial punch to not implementing that. And when it becomes so important to everyday life, that becomes important. But if we also look at the reality of that, we also have a lot of people who are not engaged with technology and take that choice, and that is a perfectly valid choice, and they are excluded from, hey, like if I don't have access to the internet, a recent one I was told is that booking GP appointments online, if that's all your GP surgery does and you don't have the internet, you have to go to a local library. Libraries don't open till 10. everyone else who's got access to the internet has booked the appointments, you are suddenly at a disadvantage. So there should always be the space to say no to technology, and that is a really important choice, thinking about VR and thinking about the future of work to facilitate. Some people will not want to do VR as work. There is a whole ton around productivity and really what VR gets us, and I'm just going to leave that because it's just very like in the air and I don't know. But having space to say no. Regulation helps. Again, the games industry is an interesting one because there doesn't feel like there's a huge legislation around gaming. That is entertainment, but there is such a public, like strong pressure amongst kind of gaming communities to be accessible. And that is another example of if someone comes up with something that's really bad in a game, like the community will gather as a force and say, hey, like this is not acceptable, you are not doing well enough. And again, companies respond to that. And I think people working in those companies start to feel that pressure as well and start to respond to it. So I think you have, like anything, quite a few different approaches of legislation. And culturally, it's also quite easy to do. Law is quite scary and hard and requires a lot of work. And yeah, it feels massive to me, but just getting a bunch of communities together and going, hey, like this isn't good enough is really powerful.
Yeah, thank you.
Got time for one more? No?
Hello. Just following from that, I was just curious about, VR's being adopted quite extensively for training purposes, isn't it? Like flight cabin simulations, nurse-patient relationships, and all that kind of stuff. And I think, well, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but it's just following from what you were saying around and empathy. Like, is that? I guess I've answered myself. It's all capitalism, isn't it? It's to speed up. It's to speed up something and to use fewer humans. So actually, I haven't got a question. Oh God.
No, like trade training is an interesting space, and like again, like if I would frame it of the ideology of what's going on in this system, I don't really trust the stats saying that VR is a better way of teaching people things. I think, again, that's coming from a financial agenda. If we look at some of the largest training companies, a lot are based in India. They're running real massive programs funded by the government, buying loads of headsets, because this is going to revolutionize the youth and train. And also they talk about poverty and the fact that these VR headsets will suddenly mean everyone has all these skills. I'm very skeptical about this, but maybe there is something in there. Again, removal from humans to me feels bad, and productivity as a driver feels bad.
Sorry, I'm following on from that.
One sec. There you go.
Just what you said there about programs that give technology to teach, to say bring people out of poverty, and so on, made me think of the way that was applied around computers in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. So that became really part of the infrastructure now, and how those computers remained because there was no money to update the systems that were provided, kind of as a training, like a gift of getting involved in these new technologies. And so you go to a library now and they will still have a computer that is 15, 20 years old. And do you think that, it seems like that would recur with VR, and there's something in, do you think there's any viability to it, or because I also have doubts, but
yeah, I mean, money is obviously a massive thing with VR, and it does feel like the plaything of people with high disposable income as a luxury of like frivolity of like, I walked off a plank and I can spend £3,500 to experience that, and I'm okay with that. So yeah, clearly like money is a big thing in VR. Meta, for all the bad things they've done, like reducing the unit price, has meant that a lot more people have been able to take that step. but those headsets, and again, if we look at the way that companies approach hardware, they are all based on having high turnover, right? They do not want you to have a machine and then have it for 10 years. They need a continuous increase in power and a continuous desire to buy new machines. Can it get to the point where it's sufficiently mass that the cost of usage is low? I don't know, we then get into weird spaces where mobile phones and like children and how it's being harmful to their health. Is VR helpful? There have been great reports from the NSPC, National Centre for Protection for Children, around VR, and Meta's response was to lower the age rate of who they will sell VR headsets to. So if it gets cheap and costs enough, I'm not sure that's necessarily good either, because it might be really harmful. It is really harmful for very young children. Yeah.
All right, I think that's probably all we've got time for. So thanks everyone for coming. If you want to find out more about what we do at the PM Studio, come and find myself or a member of the studio team. Give us a wave, studio team. Hi. Thanks a lot to Joe. That was a really great talk. If you have any questions from online, drop us a line at studio@watershed.co.uk. Okay, bye.